Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. I'm here to ask and answer one simple question. WTF is motor rock? Okay. You may be looking at the most illegal game that I have ever featured on this show. I say may, allegedly. Mostly because I don't want to get sued. But these guys might. This is also known as Rock and Roll Racing 3D. To the point, by the way, where RRR 3D is the name of the application exe. Like, that's what Windows sees. Rock and Roll Racing 3D. The site is covered in mentions of this, and yet that's not done by the company that made Rock and Roll Racing. Who made Rock and Roll Racing, you might ask? Well, you would be a very silly person not to know that. A company called Silicon Synapse. I don't know who they are. Okay, that's understandable, because they are now called Blizzard. Yes, a company that I think you should know. They made a game called Rock and Roll Racing. It was one of their first games. It was a very good one, too. Really, really fun game. Published, if I recall correctly, by Interplay, actually, who did release a sequel, although I don't believe that was actually developed by Blizzard. And it was one of the first games to actually come out with a licensed soundtrack. And I do actually mean licensed. The 5 music tracks in that game were officially and legally licensed. And they included MIDI or chiptune covers of things like George Thorogood's Bad to the Bone. Like the one that's playing in the background right now. That doesn't sound MIDI. No, not at all. In fact, this game is chock full of covers of those tracks. 15 in total, as it turns out. But it's not just the tracks that they've covered. Oh no. Let's have a look at the options menu before we begin, shall we? Now, you got your traditional isometric view. If you've never seen Rock and Roll Racing, then go look up a little bit of footage of it, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about there. And a bunch of other options, as you can very clearly see here. I'm not really sure why you can customize any of these. This doesn't seem to make a huge degree of sense. Like maximum number of players and things like that, and it's a little odd. It actually kind of harks back to the good old days where you were able to really mess with an awful lot of stuff when it came to customizing your game. I guess that's actually a good thing. The ability to reduce the number of cars on the track in the campaign, I mean, that's not something that you usually get to do. So I think that's a bit of a surprise to a lot of people. You can see the name of the cover band there, Frantic, by the way, which is amusing to say the least. Then you got these 2 variables here. I don't know what these are. SV disable video. I don't even know what that is. Enable mine bug. I wonder if that's actually from the original game. Maybe they replicated a bug from Rock and Roll Racing. It's hard to say, and a lot of these options are quite confusing, but I guess it's kind of nice that they're there. Then you've got graphics options, which are pretty good too. You can unlock the frame rate. I believe it's just capped to 60 regardless of what you set, so whatever. Doesn't really make too much of a difference. Now you got your sound here. Now this is where things start to get a little strange. What I'm going to do, by the way, is I'm going to crank this volume up right here for the commentator. This is important because this classic commentator, you think, oh, it's just in the style of Rock and Roll Racing. No, they freely admitted on the website that they lifted the voices from the Genesis version, i.e. the Mega Drive. And I'm pretty sure they did not have permission to do that. I can almost guarantee that they did not, in fact, have permission to do that. Strangely enough, Classic is now disabled, so I guess that's because I... No? What the... This is some weird stuff going on here. Let's go back here. It forgot... There you go. Commentator Classic. Okay, it's under there. It's very suspect. I've got to say, it's really, really suspect. Because I can almost guarantee that Blizzard did not give them permission for that. And indeed, on their very website, if we go to the FAQ, it actually says, under these concerns, that no one has complained yet. That's not an answer. That doesn't say Blizzard gave you permission. So, let us see, because this game might not be around for very long. So let's play it now, shall we? Let's do a tournament. Alright, here we go. And welcome to the world of rock and roll motorsports for the rock. And also possibly the roll, but maybe not both together. This looks really familiar, and kind of rightfully so, I've got to say. There's an awful lot of stuff in this game that looks awfully familiar. You might wonder why I've got cuts in this video. Well, let's just say the game has some rather weird tendencies, including the fact that it changes resolution and frame rate during the cutscenes, which actually breaks the game, pretty much. That's not too good an idea. I'm trying to avoid that. Alright, well, let's pick from these very suspiciously familiar looking cars, and we will head on in. So, do I want a Dirt Devil or a Marauder? I don't know what any of these stats mean, but I could probably guess. I assume that is speed, that is probably firepower, and that is armor. Which is which? Well, this has got a lot more firepower. In fact, this is better in every way. Okay, let's buy the thing that's better in every way then. All right, pick our color. Nice stylish black. That should work pretty well. So you can buy that, and then there's a bunch of upgrades. The interface is about the quality you can expect from a lot of these weird Russian titles. Like, these are guys that are generally pretty proficient when it comes to graphical fidelity. Like, I mean, this chrome skin on this car looks pretty good, honestly. Looks pretty good. But the interface was designed by a 12-year-old, apparently. The font choices are really strange, and a lot of this stuff doesn't really make a huge amount of sense. There's no tooltips on anything. Obviously, you can guess at most of it, but there's just this general feel of either rushing it or just not having the budget or the experience to really understand that actually, yes, it's a little bit important to present your game well. This is, of course, the first big problem with trying to clone a classic like Rock and Roll Racing or remake it in this obviously unauthorized fashion, is that people really do remember the style of Rock and Roll Racing. The music was obviously a big deal, and they've done a pretty good job of cloning a lot of that, and I'll, of course, let you hear as much of it as I can without getting copyright strikes. But it's also the idea that all of the characters had their own unique looks to them, all of the vehicles looked very cartoony, and had that really wonderful 16-bit color palette that seemed to work really well if you had the talent necessary to create the art within it. So, let's get into the race, shall we? Oh wow, this looks familiar, doesn't it? Rightfully so. It looks exactly like Rock and Roll Racing, because, hey, it's got that isometric perspective going for it, and it feels and plays like it, too, only obviously at a much higher frame rate. Now, the first thing to understand is that, as it turns out, Rock and Roll Racing was actually pretty damn hard. The reason I say that is that this isometric perspective is not something we're remotely used to anymore. So it's really, really odd to actually play a racing game with this kind of perspective. It's very, very strange indeed. Getting used to it takes quite a lot of effort. There we go. So you've got your jump power up, you've got things like I think it's oil slick that you get there as well. And you're avoiding various mines and traps and trying to get around the course as quickly as possible while fighting all of the other guys and grabbing pickups and things like that. It is exactly what you would expect from Rock and Roll Racing. Almost exactly what you would expect from Rock and Roll Racing. And here's the strange thing about all of this. Before we go, I suppose, into the legalities and the morality of blatantly cloning something without permission, and I'm not really alleging that they didn't have permission. I'm actually flat out saying they don't, because the FAQ on the website says so. What they said was, when people asked them about the copyright, is, well, we've had no complaints yet. That doesn't mean that they actually have permission. The whole better to ask forgiveness than ask permission thing is something that doesn't quite apply when you're dealing with a multi-billion-dollar game developer.
Snake scores a first-place knockout. Rep finishes second. Jake takes a weak third. Shred is in another time zone.
Doesn't that sound familiar? Yes, that is the exact announcer. The exact same announcer from Rock and Roll Racing. And that is where I think this game's going to get into pretty serious trouble. Because you want to make a game that's like Rock and Roll Racing? Cool. I mean, legally you can absolutely do that. Yeah? You've got to be pretty careful with it. You don't want to be so blatant about it, but you can absolutely make a Rock and Roll Racing clone, and you'll get away with it. But when you start using assets from the old game, that's when things start to become a bit problematic. Also, when you reference your game as Rock and Roll Racing 3D, which is a trademark you most assuredly do not own. That is owned by Blizzard and/or Interplay, depending on how that went down. So you can't really do that. That is not something that will get you very far in this industry. It's not a very good idea. And using the same announcer is just, that's going to cause them huge trouble, surely. I'm actually quite surprised this game even got onto Steam. It got through green light, and I guess Valve is now trusting the community to do their legal due diligence now for things that they sell on their stores. No, I don't think that's acceptable. So that's a little bit weird. But before we do that, before we go into this whole thing, as I said before, let's talk a little bit about the mechanics and how the game actually feels. Because the real trick to this is that it actually feels pretty good. Like, it feels like the original Rock and Roll Racing. It handles in the same weird way, you go crashing into walls in the same way that you always would, because that isometric perspective is very confusing for the most part. And you have the combat elements to it and the power-up pickups, which are all pretty good. And you upgrade your car in between. So I just earned some money so we can go for some upgrades. Let's see what we can do here. Probably not too much. Oh, not a lot at all. Wow, these are expensive. Okay. Yeah, these are not things that I can afford right now. I could upgrade my spring mechanism, but that's really about it. Let's go on to the next race and earn a little bit more cash. And it all works fine. Yeah, it all feels pretty good. Actually, very, very good. It's extremely enjoyable, and honestly, the art style is pretty good as well. Yeah, they didn't go overboard with it. It looks good until you change perspective. And this is where things get a little bit weird. I'm going to try and remember what the key is. There is a key that allows you to change in between the rear view. No, not that one. And the normal perspective. I'm going to try and find out which it is by just kind of mashing the buttons. I know there's one of them. You saw it in the options menu earlier that you could go into rear view. There it is. Oh, now it doesn't look so good. No, because honestly, it was never really designed to be looked at from this direction. And funnily enough, it makes the game a hell of a lot easier if you go into this perspective, which is why I think they shouldn't have put it in at all. Because playing in isometric is the classic way, but it's the more difficult way. It's much, much easier to drive like this. A hell of a lot easier. So, as you might imagine, you've got a lot of people who will be thinking in multiplayer, oh yeah, I'll probably want to drive like this. Rightfully so. And yes, the game does have multiplayer. There's no one actually playing it right now, but it does have multiplayer. Oh, almost beat Murdoch. How disappointing. But yeah, it doesn't look anywhere near as good there, because you've got things like texture pop-in, you have a rather obvious lack of texture quality on a lot of the scenery surrounding you, which is not evident when you're playing in isometric mode. You know, this actually looks pretty good, especially at high speed. But as soon as you look at it in any other way, like that, you suddenly notice, oh yeah, okay, so maybe it doesn't look quite as good, and there's the pop-in on the trees in the distance there, so the view distance isn't so good. But when you switch back to this, you never see any of that. So it seems to be absolutely fine. It's like, well, it's not even like that. It obviously is a case that they deliberately designed it to be played in isometric mode, put a rear view mode in there, and it wasn't like quite the priority. The game wasn't properly optimized to be played that way, which I'm kind of fine with, because you really should play a Rock and Roll Racing clone in the way that the original Rock and Roll Racing was played, but otherwise, like, why even give the option, you know? So yeah, I mean, it's fine. It plays well. It's fun. And the soundtrack's quite good as well. It's a bunch of really bad knockoffs of existing tracks, which is exactly what they did in the original Rock and Roll Racing. Only this time around, instead of it being MIDI, they've actually used the, I suppose, these kind of bad cover bands to do it. And they've changed them around a little bit, but this is obviously Deep Purple's Highway Star. And let's just put it this way. I have doubts that Deep Purple would be okay with them doing that. This is definitely not the old age of Doom imitating various tracks. But even with Rock and Roll Racing, they licensed those tracks. So I don't think that's okay here. But I'm going to let you hear some of this, just to kind of let you hear the quality of the covers and hope that that doesn't trigger Content ID. Here we go.
Snake hit the work. Scores a first-place knockout. Viper finishes second. Shred takes a weak third. Rep is in another time zone. The stage is set. The green flag drops. Snake is about to blow. Snake was blocked out there.
Yeah, so the covers are actually kind of good in their own cheesy way. They're fun to listen to in the same way that old Rock and Roll Racing music was fun to listen to. So I'm kind of okay with that. And now we come down to, is it right to clone a game like this without permission? And again, I am very much assuming, based on what they actually wrote on their website, that they quite clearly did not actually ask Blizzard for permission, or indeed any of the artists for permission to use their music here, because this is a lot of high-profile stuff. Black Sabbath is in there. Pretty sure there's some Megadeth. I heard Slayer, Deep Purple. These are not the kind of things you can generally license for a $6 indie game from Russia. So, if I'm honest, the only real problem that I have with it is the use of unlicensed stuff, yeah? I mean, the fact that they said, yeah, for the longest time, this is Rock'n'Roll Racing 3D, and then renamed it just before it came out, indicates that they know that they're doing the wrong thing here, and they're just going to do it anyway, because it sounded like a good idea at the time. They're just hoping they get away with it. That seems to be the attitude there. And it's not okay to use assets from the old game without asking. But we do come on to the issue of abandonware, I suppose, which is something that some people are arguing makes this okay. Rock'n'Roll Racing is abandonware, which is kind of true. You know, you can't legally buy Rock'n'Roll Racing. It was never on the PC platform. You have to emulate it in order to even play it. So, is it okay to use assets? Well, I still think probably not, you know? It is not okay to take that stuff and sort of profit off the memory of something nostalgic like this. You could do an imitator, you could do kind of a spiritual successor to it, but don't say this is the remake of Rock'n'Roll Racing. Don't rename your game a couple of days before you actually release it and claim that, oh no, we knew nothing about this. And don't use sound effects from the original. That's the most ridiculous thing about it. The covers, I think, are maybe a less egregious crime. I think that you can maybe get away with that. It's not the same tracks. They're doing covers. They're altering them a bit. Alright. It's a bit fishy, but it's not dreadful, you know? But using Blizzard assets, that's probably not good. And I have a feeling that this game might not stay around for too much longer. And that would, to some degree, actually be quite sad. Because we have been wanting a new Rock'n'Roll Racing game for a while, and it will never happen. I think, you know, we always came to accept that. So, kind of leaves it up to other companies to make something like that. It's the same as, like, think about Dungeon Keeper, for instance. You know, here's a parallel scenario. Dungeon Keeper, there will never be another Dungeon Keeper outside of that terrible mobile game, okay? And nobody gives a damn about that if they're a PC gamer. So, War for the Overworld is coming along. Not only that, but it actually even uses the original voice actor, but they legally contracted him. They didn't actually take the voice samples from the original game. But it is Dungeon Keeper, yeah? Very similar to it. Is that okay? Well, I think so. I mean, it definitely helps that Peter Molyneux gave it its blessing. You know, that's probably the biggest deal there. Let's just say he didn't, though. Would it be okay to clone Dungeon Keeper in this day and age when there is really no chance of a new Dungeon Keeper actually coming out? That is a really debatable point, and that's what makes this whole thing a little bit murky, and it would have made it a whole lot murkier if they didn't decide just to up and use assets that they clearly didn't own. If this was just a straight-up spiritual successor, as you can call it, and just it evoked the memory of the other game, it wasn't actually a straight-up rip-off, I suppose. And you add into that the fact that actually it is a bit of a shame because it's a pretty good rip-off. It's actually really fun to play. I am having a blast with it. Outside of the crappy menus and the various problems with the cutscenes and things like that, it's actually fun. And it is a nice little piece of nostalgia, I've got to admit. It's hard for me to argue with how well they've actually made the game work mechanically. It almost seems like this kind of was a labor of love. And that makes me, I think, a bit more sympathetic to them because it's not, I don't know if they intended to infringe necessarily, even though they obviously did, but they didn't do this just to make some money. They did it because they wanted to remake Rock'n'Roll Racing. So there's a bit of passion involved in that. It's not just some cynical cash-in. It's actually good at what it does. But unfortunately, that's not enough to justify it, I think, in the eyes of the law, and I very much doubt that this game is going to stay up. Maybe an agreement could be reached, but the fact that they did it without permission in the first place is a bit unfortunate. So, I don't know about recommending this to you, because do I have a moral obligation not to recommend you this game on the basis that they are probably doing something illegal? I don't know if that's really my responsibility, especially since it's out on Steam, you know? Valve is currently selling a game which may very well infringe. We don't know. We're not 100% sure, but we can pretty much guess. But I gotta be honest here, it's actually pretty good for what it is. It is a really fun clone of Rock'n'Roll Racing, and I have been having a lot of fun with it. So it would be a shame if it were to disappear, but you could also completely understand if it will. Maybe some kind of amicable agreement can be reached, but it's a bit shady, isn't it? In fact, It's not just a bit shady, it's extremely shady. So there you go, folks. Motor Rock, currently available on Steam for $7, your regional equivalent. A very strange tale indeed. I'm looking forward to seeing how this actually develops. My name's been TotalBiscuit. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Knockout! Shred finishes second. Snake takes a weak third. Jake is in another time zone.